Your history class may have taught you that we've unraveled the mysteries of almost all of humanity's modern development. But what if we only know part of the story?
Yeah, is there any truth to the old myths that our current era is one of many? Did cultures even more technologically and spiritually advanced than our own once flourish but then vanish, leaving only faint traces?
Well, join us for this episode of Edge of Wonder, all about the lost city of Atlantis. We are your hosts. I'm Ben.
And I'm Rob. In this episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the facts, fabrication, and fairy tales of one of mankind's greatest mysteries. Atlantis has puzzled treasure hunters, philosophers, researchers, archaeologists, and everyone in between for years.
So as a quick recap, this episode is technically a continuation of the Atlantis series we originally made for Edge of Wonder. In our previous episodes, we looked into things like the Richat Structure. We mentioned that the size and shape of the structure was very close to the Atlantis that Plato wrote about in his two dialogues called Timaeus and Critias.
The Richat Structure is also called the Eye of the Sahara and was first discovered by Richard Mollard in 1948. The main part that stands out the most is the concentric circular structure that looks exactly like how Plato describes it. Quote, alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, unquote.
Yeah, and another factor that plays into the Richat Structure is Herodotus' map from 450 BC. It shows Atlantis to the west of Libya, which could also be a hint to the shape of the structure. Since we already covered this structure in that episode, we won't get into much here. But please go back and watch that episode since we had some great information on Atlantis.
Yeah, in part 2 of that series, we went into Antarctica and found evidence that it also might be linked to Atlantis. But for this new series on ancient civilizations, we've uncovered so much more that we haven't talked about before, which is why we decided to bring you more episodes on the topic.
Atlantis is a topic that everyone, no matter what your views are in life, seems to be interested in. There are so many sides to the Atlantis story that when we started to do more digging, especially after our series on Tartaria, we found some of the craziest information out there.
Ancient myths, research from James Cameron, parts of Plato's documentation that everyone is overlooking, and evidence of superfloods. I mean, you won't believe what we found.
First, let's go way back. We've all heard about this lost land. But just what is Atlantis? Well, the most interesting account actually came from the Greek philosopher Plato.
In the 4th century BC, Plato wrote 2 dialogues we mentioned before called Timaeus and Critias, where he talked about Atlantis, a civilization that was destroyed in one day. But if you thought this was just going to be a boring history lesson, here comes the controversy.
Now, most researchers fall into 2 camps about Plato's story. One is that Atlantis is completely made up. After all, history says that Plato was just a philosopher, so why would he suddenly become a historian?
And the story of a culture being destroyed after turning wicked is just the sort of moral tale that Plato would have wanted to pass to his students, right?
But just because something has a good moral lesson to it, does that make it just a story? I mean, in basically all of human history, good has triumphed over evil. Look at the Bible, Torah, other religious texts, legends, or even fairy tales.
They're full of stories of good people being rewarded and evil punished. And that's not to mention in everyday life. We've all experienced instant karma where we do something we know we shouldn't and something bad happens.
Yes, sir!
Opposite the camp who believes Atlantis is fake, there's the camp who is Atlantis believers. And it's not just spiritual people or conspiracy theorists who think Atlantis was real.
There are many archaeologists and historians who think the Atlantis myth came from a real story, but was exaggerated or altered. Many are featured in a National Geographic documentary called Finding Atlantis.
And a team of archaeologists, geologists, and anthropologists now focus on satellite photos of the area.
And after all, it wouldn't be the first time a Greek myth turned out to be true.
You've probably heard of the Greek poet Homer and his intricate story, the Iliad. It was about a battle between the Greeks and the Trojans from a mythical city of Troy.
Troy was considered by some to be made up, just a legend. That is, until Troy was actually found in 1870. Of course, whether or not a demigod named Achilles existed, who could only be killed when someone hit his heel, has yet to be confirmed. But who knows?
But if the existence of something as legendary as Troy was unconfirmed for such a long time, why would we assume Atlantis is fake? Well, let's get into the history that made us think that it really wasn't just a myth.
So, where did the original tale of Atlantis come from? How about from an advanced culture that was destroyed by a bigger volcano than the one that destroyed Pompeii?
The Minoans were in the Mediterranean in 3000 BC, long before the Greeks. On the surface, the Minoan civilization had many similarities to Atlantis.
Right, check this out. 1. Both the Atlantean and Minoan cultures were associated with bulls. 2. Both were reportedly great sailors.
3. Both held a large amount of territory. And 4. Both were very technologically advanced.
Did you know that the Minoans even had indoor plumbing, which wasn't really seen much again until the late 1800s? Which is weird if you think about it. I mean, in the 1800s, we could take photographs and even had electricity. So why was indoor plumbing so far down the list of modern improvements?
It's kind of
I mean, you'd think that's an issue we want to work out.
Right away,
You know?
in the very beginning. Yeah.
The matter, Greg, RN, is that when this toilet is flushed, it runs. And when you have a septic tank that's nearly full and a toilet that's been running all night, then you could have a hell of a problem.
But anyway, back to the Minoans. One of their settlements was on an island called Thera, which happened to have a volcano on it.
Then, boom, around 1470 BC, it erupted, causing an explosion as powerful as 40 atomic bombs. No one on the island survived, just like in the story of Atlantis.
But there are some problems with the Minoan Atlantis theory. Yes, the people on Thera were all killed, but the Minoan civilization continued on after the explosion. Whereas in the Atlantis myth, their whole empire was wiped out after their catastrophe.
Also, the Minoan story is missing some important parts of the Atlantis one, like Atlantis' famous city center.
I think we can debunk this Minoans or Atlantean theory even more. The Minoans were to the east of Greece, but the Atlanteans were said to be in the west. So maybe we have to look elsewhere for the truth.
Another interesting Atlantis theory was actually put forth by James Cameron. Yes, the same James Cameron who dived into the abyss looking for mysteries, brought us to an alien world in Avatar, and explored transhumanism in The Terminator. He was also apparently on the hunt for Atlantis and even made a documentary about it with National Geographic called Atlantis Rising.
We're doing this?
We're doing it.
Going after Atlantis? One of the peak civilizations of its day. A city that disappeared overnight.
They want to hear.
So in other words, you're saying he is doing everything except making Avatar 2, which was supposed to be out 60 years ago by now. I mean, we had the entire Game of Thrones saga in the time since Avatar, the first Avatar came out.
That's like shocking when you put it that way. James Cameron's Atlantis Rising had an interesting theory that Atlantis was an island near the coast of Spain. And after we saw the evidence why, we think that maybe this ancient civilization really did exist and trickle down into our present times.
After the lost culture in Spain was destroyed, refugees spread Atlantean culture to the middle of the Mediterranean and possibly even as far as the Azores, a tiny group of islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean.
Now, what's crazy is that you can find similar architecture in all of these places. Check out these circular building designs and large structures made of stone stacked on top of one another.
But wait, I want to ask all of you, have you ever tried to make a rock tower?
Yes, if Legos count. Surprised that you don't have that Millennium Falcon one done already.
Dude, I've been wanting to get that, but it's like, it's massive. Anyway. Really, rock towers are not as easy as they look. Now, imagine trying to make a whole house of stacked rocks that can last 1,000 years.
And look over here, a moat, surrounded by water, concentric circles.
Yeah, that takes a lot of skill and planning, but why do we care about this architecture? Well, the buildings are made out of concentric circles, just like the Richat structure. It's super interesting because they're straight out of the Atlantis myth.
When Plato wrote about Atlantis, he said that the capital was a large city with a temple in the middle.
The heart of Atlantis lies in the eyes of her king.
Around the temple were alternating rings of land and water. Now, Disney may have even referenced this in their movie Atlantis: The Lost Empire, when they made a lot of the symbols in the city to be circular.
But James Cameron's team was on the hunt for some evidence they could touch, not a cartoon, and they think they may have found this real symbol of Atlantis.
Tres círculos concéntricos y un canal que entra. Y lo que hay en el centro, que simbólicamente puede ser el templo de Poseidón.
Archaeologists found circular inscriptions in southern Spain. They think that the center was a temple dedicated to Poseidon, surrounded by alternating rings of land and water.
So if the symbols of Atlantis trickled down to appear in our modern times, what else might Atlantis have influenced? One theory is about the biblical menorah. Check this clip out.
Una menorá. Círculos concéntricos, menorá.
You're saying the biblical menorah that was in the temple in Jerusalem, that's in the book of Exodus, is an evolution of the Atlantean symbol of the concentric circles.
Estoy convencido.
Okay, all these archaeological finds are super interesting, but really James Cameron only scratched the surface of the truth about Atlantis. He even left out the most interesting parts of Plato's dialogue that would completely change our history books. Get ready to hear the most insane stuff we found. Now wait a minute, before we get into this, if you start researching our history, most things that will come up on a Google search are that first, dumb cavemen finally learned how to use tools. Then slowly, humans developed to finally be smart enough to do our taxes, which I was doing all last month, and I can tell you I'm still not smart enough to do them.
I wish you learned that in school.
Yeah.
It's like, here, you learn algebra, but we're not going to teach you how to do taxes.
I learned how to send an email to an accountant. That's what I learned how to do.
Oh my gosh. Where's all your money gone, Daddy? Taxes.
But what we found about Atlantis totally changed how mainstream science tells us history developed. In the accepted historical version, the story is that around 10,000 BC, humans transitioned from being completely wild and primitive hunter-gatherers into farmers.
It supposedly took thousands of years before anything resembling civilization came about. In other words, if you're looking for an ancient civilization, it's not going to exist yet more than 5,000 or 6,000 years ago.
But this creates a huge problem.
A big problem.
Yeah, it seems to contradict Plato. What date did Plato give us when Atlantis was destroyed? Plato said Atlantis was destroyed 9,000 years before his time.
Before his time.
Yes.
That's over 11,000 years ago today, which would make it twice as old as the oldest civilization that mainstream history says existed. If that's true, that would completely rewrite everything we know about human history.
Right, and keep in mind that that year is just when Atlantis supposedly ended. Who knows how long before that? So Plato hinted at a much longer history that went back in time. So how old could Atlantis be?
And how old could human civilization itself be? Remember the problematic bones of Lucy, the first human ever discovered, which was dated back over 3 million years? This stuff completely throws the timeline of Darwinism and human evolution out the window.
Right, in our Tartaria series, we talked about how a declassified CIA document said that Tartaria was deliberately covered up so the Russian Soviets could push the ideology of Darwinism with the goal of spreading communism far and wide. Is the same thing going on here with Atlantis?
Now, whether or not you believe the story of Atlantis, we can look at the facts. Also, many researchers do take the Atlantis legend very seriously.
Yo pienso que la gente que opina que esto no es serio es simplemente porque no se lo han tomado en serio. Yo creo en la búsqueda honesta de la verdad, esté donde esté, sea cual sea, y caiga quien caiga.
I find it kind of strange that historians and explorers will use parts of Plato's writings to justify why they think they found Atlantis. But at the same time, they ignore seemingly important parts, like when Plato says it was.
Right. For instance, there's the Sardinian researcher Robert Ishoy,
God bless you,
who said that Sardinia may have been Atlantis.
This culture here on Sardinia matches everything Plato describes about Atlantis. He talked about the culture as being a very advanced culture. We look at the architecture. This is very advanced technique.
It is amazing.
So Robert mentioned that Sardinian buildings were built with black, red, and white stones, just like Plato said. But he doesn't mention that the people in Sardinia who built that stuff existed thousands of years after Plato's dates.
Were those people inspired by earlier structures they saw from Atlantis, or are the dates just off?
But to be fair, I get why people would brush off the more impossible parts of Plato's story. They would rewrite the whole course of human development, which would again undermine Darwin, so that's why it is hard for people to accept.
Which is why I tend to believe Plato here.
Right.
But why would Plato get such trivial details right, like Atlantean pillars and stone colors, while getting the time period so completely wrong? I mean, these things just don't add up.
Right, and that's the whole thing in the Bible is like that too. They try to discredit because it's like everything matches up, but then they're like, oh no, the time doesn't work. And it's like, well, they're covering it up maybe, you know? But imagine writing a school report and getting it correct that the ancient Romans liked the color purple, but then saying that they lived in 1982. You would probably get an F. And if you didn't, you should.
I don't know. I had friends in school named Roman. I could have convinced them, I think.
Maybe. But anyway, the time frame around Atlantis isn't the only thing that gets ignored. Take a listen to this from Plato.
The Atlanteans came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean, for in those days the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island situated in front of the straits, which are by you called the Pillars of Heracles, and was the way to other islands, and from these you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent which surrounded the true ocean.
Let's break that down. So there was a group of people who lived on an island just outside of the Mediterranean Sea. In other words, Atlantis was in the Atlantic Ocean? I guess we all should have thought about that. I mean, it is called Atlantic, and from this island, you could get into other islands in the Atlantic Ocean further west.
Yeah, why is it called the Atlantic Ocean if Atlantis wasn't there?
Exactly.
Also, you know, when it says they came from the Atlantic, honestly, were they in the ocean?
Don't worry, I have diplomatic clearance.
So you could get to other islands in the Atlantic Ocean further west. Places like the Azores, perhaps? From these islands, Plato said people could sail to the opposite continent, which surrounded the true ocean. And what continent is opposite Europe? Hello, it's us, America. And how would Plato have known about America 1,300 years before its official discovery?
But wait, wasn't Atlantis supposed to be a mythical place? Well, Plato wasn't the only person talking about the opposite continent.
Many Greek historians and philosophers all wrote about the opposite continent. People like Aristotle, Theopompus, a historian during the time of Alexander the Great, Plutarch, a Greek historian who is said to have influenced Shakespeare, and Strabo, who created the most extensive book of geography still remaining during the reign of Roman Emperor Augustus. Plato even said that Atlanteans had territory on part of the opposite continent. This is pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah. So it really sounds like we're talking about a worldwide empire at a time when human beings were supposed to be running around in loincloths and eating raw meat. How is this possible? And why are so many researchers ignoring the most interesting parts about Atlantis?
If there were advanced people that long ago, what happened to them?
Yeah.
I mean, did they have scientific and spiritual knowledge that's been lost? I mean, we can assume that, right?
Of course. What else has to be rewritten in our history books? These aren't the only pieces of the Atlantis myth that routinely get ignored. Most modern-day reports say that Plato is the only source we have for information on Atlantis. But what if we told you that's completely false?
There are other ancient scholars talking about Atlantis, but who were they? And what the heck are cocaine mummies? I mean, I need to know. A new rock band from Seattle? I mean, really? And what about the declassified CIA document about the search for Atlantis?
And the answer is of cocaine mummies going to be in the next episode. So stay tuned for the next part in our series where we get into these cocaine mummies and how it relates to Atlantis, how Atlantis really got wiped out, and so much more.
We love you guys, and until next time, we'll see you out
on the edge.
Ready?
Yeah.
So this is like sardines. Sardinian.
No.
Dude, we were totally sending emails.
No, I didn't have an email until 2001.
Wow.
Yeah.
Live in the now.
Yeah. All right. Also, not to mention all the stuff that Nikola Tesla was doing.
You mean with plumbing, or?
Yeah. Using plumbing and electricity.
Imagine if Nikola Tesla put his mind to the plumbing issue. First it was the Rubik's Cube.
Yeah.
Now it's a master Legos builder.
Yeah.
Wait, do that again. I thought you were talking to me, not the camera.
Well, I kind of was, because we were just finishing this conversation.
Well, okay, go ahead and do it.
Okay.
Hey guys, hope you're enjoying this episode.
If you want to watch the rest and get access to our full catalog of content with hundreds of videos that will keep you entertained for hours and hours, subscribe to rise.tv.
Also, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss a single new drop.
Yeah, and we'll see you out on the edge.